You are sitting on a plane. You have been awake since 4 in the morning. You are exhausted. You are grieving. You are trying to hold yourself together by sheer willpower alone, and all you want is to close your eyes, pull your hoodie over your head, and disappear for 9 hours. The seat next to you is occupied by a stranger. He is quiet. He is reading. He smells faintly of cedar and old books. You do not look at him. He does not look at you. You are two people who share nothing. Not a name. Not a history. Not even a glance. Just an armrest. Just 3 inches of airline fabric separating your two lives. And then turbulence hits. And your hand slips. And he speaks. 4 words. Simple. Ordinary, polite words. Words a stranger says to a stranger on a plane 1,000 times a day. But those 4 words will shatter everything Maya Johnson has ever believed about her life, her family, and who she is in this world. Because the man in seat 24A is not just a stranger. He has been looking for Maya Johnson for 27 years, and neither of them had any idea the other one was alive. This is not a movie. This is not a novel. This happened. This is the story of 2 people. A 34-year-old Black woman from Atlanta, Georgia, and a 61-year-old white man from Edinburgh, Scotland, who were placed next to each other on a transatlantic flight by an airline's random seating algorithm, and discovered somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean at 37,000 feet that they were father and daughter. Stay with me. Maya Joelle Johnson was born on the 14th of March, 1990, in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Atlanta, Georgia. Her mother, Denise Johnson, was 23 years old, recently unemployed, and completely alone. There was no baby shower. There were no balloons in the hospital hallway. There was just Denise and her newborn daughter, and a story she had already decided to tell. A story that would become the foundation of everything Maya ever believed about herself. Her father, Denise told her, had died before she was born. A car accident. He never got to know she existed. He never got to hold her. He was just a man who was there, and then was not. And Maya, who was a child, and then a teenager, and then a young woman, believed her. Why would she not? Denise Johnson was not the kind of woman you questioned. She was brilliant and proud and fiercely protective of her daughter. She worked double shifts at a medical billing office for most of Maya's childhood. She made sure Maya had her school supplies in September and a birthday cake in March, and a mother who showed up. What she did not give her daughter was the truth about where she came from. Maya grew up on the east side of Atlanta with her grandmother close by, a tight circle of girlfriends from church, and a mother who loved her without apology. She was the kind of child who paid attention. Her 3rd-grade teacher wrote on a report card that Maya noticed things other children missed. She would grow up to be a pediatric nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. The kind of nurse who remembered which kids were afraid of needles and which ones needed a joke before the blood draw. She was compassionate and detail-oriented and deeply, specifically present for the people in her care. It is worth noting that detail, because the woman who noticed everything, the nurse who caught what others overlooked, had spent 34 years living inside a story with a hole in it, and had never once managed to see the shape of what was missing. But grief has a way of doing that. Grief has a way of cracking things open that were sealed so long they almost forgot they were closed. Denise Johnson was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2017. She fought it with the same ferocious quiet that she had applied to everything else in her life. She told Maya not to worry. She told everyone not to worry. She went to chemotherapy on Tuesday mornings and was back at her desk by Thursday. And she did not talk about the fear, not out loud, not to anyone. But somewhere in those 2 years, between diagnosis and the end, something shifted inside Denise. Because a woman who has spent 30 years keeping a secret, and who suddenly understands that she is running out of time to make it right, will start to make decisions. Quietly, privately. Decisions that feel too small to matter and too enormous to fully face. Denise Johnson made several of those decisions in the last 2 years of her life. And she made them alone. And she died in the spring of 2019 without telling Maya any of them. What Maya found, 8 months after her mother's funeral, was a shoebox. She had been putting off cleaning out her mother's apartment for most of that year. She had been telling herself she was not ready. She was not ready. The shoebox was under the bed, which was exactly the kind of place Denise would have chosen. As accessible enough to reach in a moment of reckoning, hidden enough to avoid on every ordinary day. Inside the shoebox, a bundle of letters, sealed, unopened, every single one of them stamped in red ink. Return to sender. Underneath the letters, a black and white photograph of a young white man laughing at what appeared to be a jazz bar. A drink in his hand, and his head thrown back, and his whole face lit up with something uncomplicated and alive. And underneath the photograph, a letter handwritten on yellow-lined paper. Dated 2018. From her mother. To her. Maya sat on the floor of her mother's bedroom, and she read that letter. And then she read it again. And then she put it face down on the carpet for a long time and stared at the ceiling. The letter did not explain everything. Denise was not the kind of woman who explained everything, even in a letter written for her daughter to find after she was gone. But it explained enough. It explained the name on those returned envelopes. It explained the man in the photograph. And it explained, in Denise's careful, controlled handwriting, why she had done what she did in 1989. Why she had disappeared, why she had said what she said, why she had built the story she built and made her daughter live inside it for 34 years. Maya read the letter and then she opened her laptop. And she typed a name into a search engine. And what she found on the other side of that search would lead her, 4 months later, to Delta Flight 472, departing Atlanta at 9:45 in the evening, bound for London Heathrow. Now we need to talk about the man in seat 24A. His name is Robert Calloway. He is 61 years old. He is a retired professor of African history. At the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, he has written 4 books. The best known of them is a work called Roots Without Borders: African Identity in the Diaspora, which is still taught in graduate programs in the United Kingdom and the United States. He is soft-spoken and meticulous, and the kind of man who takes notes by hand in fountain pen in a leather notebook that he replaces every 2 years. He has been married for over 2 decades to a woman named Helen. He has one daughter, Sarah, who is 29 and lives in Glasgow and works as a social worker. He is by every visible measure a quiet and settled and accomplished man, and he has been carrying a guilt for 32 years that has quietly reshaped every single thing about how he lives. In 1988, Robert Calloway was 23 years old and in Atlanta on a Fulbright scholarship, doing preliminary research for what would become his doctoral thesis on African diasporic identity in the American South. He was young and curious and completely in love with the city. He found Atlanta electric in a way that Edinburgh never had been. The food, the music, the conversations. The sense that history was alive and contested and present in the air. He met Denise Johnson on a Tuesday night in October at a jazz bar in Little 5 Points. She was 21 and working the door and studying accounting at night. They started talking during a break in the music. They talked for 4 hours. He walked her to her car. He called her the next day. And for the next 4 months, they were together in the way that only 20-something people in a new city can be together. Completely and recklessly, and without any real thought about what comes next. Then, in February of 1989, Denise stopped answering his calls. He went to her apartment. She had moved. He wrote letters. The same letters Maya would find 3 decades later in a shoebox, stamped red, never opened. He asked mutual friends. No one knew anything, or if they did, they were not saying. He went back to his research. He finished his degree. He went back to Edinburgh, and he spent the next 30 years trying to understand what he had done wrong. What he had said. What he had missed. Whether it had been real for her at all. He never got an answer. He just carried the question. And then, in 2022, Robert Calloway's daughter Sarah bought him an Ancestry DNA kit for Christmas. Mostly as a joke, mostly because he was always talking about Seat's roots and identity, and she thought it would amuse him to run his own profile. He did the test. He uploaded the results. And 6 weeks later, the website sent him a notification. A close family match had appeared. Confidence, level, 99.4%. Predicted relationship, child or sibling, name, Maya Johnson, age, 34, location, Atlanta, Georgia. Robert Calloway sat at his desk in Edinburgh and stared at that notification for a long time. He printed it out. He folded the paper carefully in half. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he carried it with him every day for weeks, trying to figure out what to do with it. He could not call. He did not have a number. He could not write. He had tried writing to Atlanta before, and the letters came back. He booked a flight to Atlanta in early 2024, telling Helen and Cece was research, which was true, in a way. He wanted to go back. He wanted to see if he could find some trace of Denise, some doorway back into that question that had never been answered. He spent 4 days in Atlanta. He walked through Little 5 Points. He stood outside the building where the jazz bar had been. He found nothing, and on the night before his flight home, he sat in his hotel room and thought about a woman named Maya Johnson in this city who did not know he existed. And he did not know how to cross that distance. Denise had written, in her careful accountant's handwriting, the name Robert Calloway. She had written a description of him. His accent, Hicks's laugh, his obsession with African history, the way he took notes in fountain pen. She had written that she had been in love with him, which was the first time Maya had ever heard her mother use that word about any man. And she had written, very plainly, the reason she had left. In 1989, Denise Johnson discovered she was pregnant. The week she decided to disappear. She was 21 years old, unmarried, and she was a black woman in Atlanta carrying a white man's child. And she was terrified. Not of Robert. The letter made clear she did not believe Robert had done anything wrong. She was terrified of what the world would do with her daughter. She was terrified of what her own family would say. She was terrified of raising a child who would be caught between 2 worlds, claimed fully by neither, in a country that did not yet have the language or the grace to hold her gently. And so she made the only decision that felt survivable. She disappeared. She told Robert she had miscarried. She told her daughter he had died. And she lived inside that story for 30 years. What Maya felt sitting on the floor of her mother's apartment, reading that letter, was not a single emotion. It was several emotions arriving at the same time, stacked on top of each other in a way that made it impossible to name any one of them cleanly. There was grief. Not new grief, but old grief. The kind that had been sitting underneath her regular grief for months, without her knowing it was there. There was anger. There was a strange and uncomfortable compassion. And there was something she could not name yet. Something that had to do with the fact that she was 34 years old, and she had a father who was alive, and who apparently did not know she existed, and whose name was Robert Calloway, and who had spent the last 30 years doing research on belonging. She typed his name into a search engine. She found his faculty page at the University of Edinburgh. She found his books. She found a photograph on his publisher's website. A headshot, professional, taken in what appeared to be his office. She stared at that photograph for a very long time. He was older, obviously. Gray at the temples, glasses, a quietness in his face that photographs of him in his 20s did not have. But the eyes were the same eyes as the man in the jazz bar photograph from her mother's shoebox. She knew it the way you know things you cannot prove. In your chest before your brain has caught up. She did not reach out. Not immediately. She had a conference to think about. She had a life to think about. She had a mother's letter to sit with, and a dead woman's decisions to try to understand. She almost canceled the conference in the weeks that followed. She came close, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, to emailing her supervisors and saying she would not be going to London. Something stopped her. She does not know what. She booked her seat. Delta Flight 472. Atlanta to London Heathrow. Departing 9:45 p.m. Robert Calloway booked his return flight home to Edinburgh via London on the same airline, so through a travel agent who found him the cheapest connection. He had been in Atlanta for 4 days. He had not found what he was looking for. He was tired and sad of a man who has chased something for 30 years and cannot shake the feeling that he has been chasing in the wrong direction. He checked in online that morning. The system assigned him seat 24A. He did not think about it. He packed his leather notebook. He took a car to the airport. He got on the plane. Maya checked in at the gate. She had barely slept. She was carrying a tote bag with a change of clothes, her nursing conference badge, and a copy of her mother's letter folded into her jacket pocket, the same jacket pocket, though she did not know this, where Robert Calloway was carrying the printed DNA match. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass. She walked down the jetway. She found her row. She put her bag in the overhead bin. She sat down in seat 24B. The man in seat 24A glanced up briefly, nodded, went back to his book. She put her headphones on. She closed her eyes. Delta, Flight 472, pushed back from the gate at 9:52 p.m. It reached cruising altitude over the Georgia coast. Most of the cabin lights dimmed. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with drinks and small packets of pretzels. Maya slept for a while, restlessly, the way you sleep on planes, when you have too much on your mind. Robert read his book. Neither of them spoke. For 3 hours and 42 minutes, they were two strangers who happened to be occupying adjacent seats on a long transatlantic flight, which is one of the most anonymous social situations a human being can find themselves in. Nobody knows anybody. Nobody is required to be anybody. You are all just passengers, suspended in the same metal tube above the same dark ocean, temporarily reduced to the same anonymity. And then the plane hit turbulence. It was not severe, the kind that wakes you up but does not alarm you. The aircraft shuddered. The drink cart rattled somewhere behind them, and Maya jolted awake with her hand already reaching for something solid. Her hand landed on the armrest. His hand was there. They both pulled back. Then they both laughed. The small, embarrassed laugh of two strangers whose personal space has been accidentally violated. He said he was sorry. She said it was fine. She said it was just turbulence. He said it had been a long flight already. She agreed, and something opened. He asked what had brought her to Atlanta. She told him she was based there, born and raised on the East Side. He asked what she did. She told him she was a nurse, pediatric. He said he had once had a nurse save his life in a hospital in Cape Town years ago, an extraordinary woman, and Maya had her mother's cheekbones. He said it as a casual observation. Not a compliment, exactly, just something he noticed. Maya felt a strange flutter of something she could not identify move through her, and she said nothing. He introduced himself. Robert, she said Maya. They shook hands in the tight space of adjacent airplane seats. An awkward and formal gesture that somehow felt right. He told her he was a professor, retired now, African history. He had been in Atlanta for research. Going back to a city he had spent time in years ago, trying to reconnect with something he had left behind. He said it vaguely. In the way people summarized things they are not ready to fully explain. She nodded. She asked where he was based. Edinburgh, he said. She asked if he had family there. His wife, Helen. His daughter, Sarah. He paused, and then he said, I had hoped once to find someone else. He did not elaborate. She did not ask. But the pause sat between them with a weight to it that she would only understand later. She told him that her mother had just passed the year before. He said he was sorry. He asked her mother's name. Maya, said Denise. Denise Johnson. And the man in seat 24A, this quiet, gray-templed, soft-spoken professor from Edinburgh, went completely still. Not startled exactly, not quite shocked, but something passed across his face that was too large and too specific to be a coincidence. His jaw tightened. His eyes changed. He set his book down very carefully on his tray table, and he said, almost without breath, Denise Johnson, from East Atlanta, born in 1967, and Maya's heart did something it had never done before. It did not speed up. It stopped. Completely. For one full second. And then she said, How did you know that? He did not answer immediately. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has rehearsed this moment, and also has not rehearsed it at all. He placed it flat on her tray table, and he did not say anything. He just let her read it, and what Maya Johnson saw, on that piece of paper, on a Delta flight, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean at 37,000 feet, at 2 in the morning, while most of the other passengers slept, was a printout from an Ancestry DNA website. At the top, Robert Calloway. Below it, in the section labeled Close Family Matches, Maya Johnson. Confidence level, 99.4%. Predicted relationship, child or sibling. She read it once. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Her hands were not shaking yet. But something in her body understood what was happening. Before her mind was willing to follow, she looked at the man sitting 3 inches to her left. She looked at the printout. She looked back at him. He was watching her with an expression she would later describe as the face of someone who has been waiting for a very long time and is not sure, even now that the moment has arrived, whether they are allowed to feel relief. 11 minutes passed. Neither of them said a word, and then Maya Johnson said the first thing that came into her head, which was not elegant, and was not composed, and was not the kind of thing a a person plans to say this when they discover their father. You were in Atlanta. You were just there. You were looking for her, weren't you? And he said yes. For the remaining 5 hours of the flight, Maya Johnson and Robert Calloway talked. They did not talk about everything. There was too much, and they were also both in a kind of shock that does not announce itself, but simply operates in the background, making everything feel slightly underwater. But they talked about the things that mattered first. Robert told her about Atlanta in 1988, about Denise at the jazz bar, about the 4 months they spent together, about the letters he sent that came back. All of them, everyone, until he finally stopped sending them. About the 30 years of wondering whether he had done something wrong, or said something wrong, or simply failed to be what she needed. And never being able to ask because she was unreachable. And there being no internet yet. No social media. No way to find a person who did not want to be found. Maya listened to all of this with her hands flat on her knees and her face very still in the way her face went when she was processing. Something that her body had not caught up with yet. She pulled out her phone. She showed him a photograph of her mother. Denise at a cookout in the summer, probably 2014 or 2015, laughing at something off camera, wearing a yellow dress, completely unguarded. Robert looked at the photograph for a long time. Longer than was comfortable. He did not say anything at first. Then he said, quietly, "She was remarkable." Maya said, "I know she was," and they both sat with that for a moment. There was a grief in it that belonged to both of them, and also belonged to entirely different histories. And it was strange to be sharing it at 37,000 feet, with a man she had never met, and who was somehow, probably completely, her father. Maya told him about the shoebox, about finding the letters, his letters, still sealed, every one of them, never opened. He absorbed this information. Without speaking, she watched something shift in his face when she said it. The realization that Denise had received them, had held them in her hands, had made a decision not to open them. It was not easy information for him to receive. It did not make the 30 years simpler or cleaner. If anything, it made them more complicated. Because it meant that for 3 decades, Denise had known exactly where she stood and had chosen to stand there anyway. Maya did not have a defense for her mother that felt adequate, but she offered the one she had. She was 21 years old, she said. She was afraid. She was trying to protect me from something she could not name. I don't agree with what she did, but I understand it, and that is the most I can give her right now. What neither of them talked about, not on that plane, not night, was the second half of Denise's letter. Maya had read the whole letter that night on her mother's bedroom floor. She had read the first half, about the pregnancy and the decision and the fear and the years of living inside a story she had built for herself. And she had read the second half. And the second half had contained something that Maya was not ready to hand to this man at 37,000 feet with nowhere to go. And 5 more hours before they landed, because the second half of the letter changed things in a way that the first half did not. And she needed to think about it before she said it out loud. When the plane landed at Heathrow, they stood in the aisle next to each other for a moment. The cabin was filling with the noise of people gathering bags and pulling on jackets and checking phones. Robert reached into his jacket pocket. Not the same pocket where the DNA printout had been, the other one. And he produced a business card. He held it out to her. She took it. They looked at each other in the aisle of a plane, surrounded by strangers, somewhere between everything that had already happened and everything that was about to happen. Neither of them moved for a second. Then line started moving, and they were swept along with it, out of the aircraft, into the terminal, toward passport control. They went through separate lines. British passport, American passport. By the time Maya was through, she could not see him in the crowd. She texted her best friend, Tamara, from the arrivals hall. The message said, "Something happened on the plane. I can't explain it yet. I'm okay, I think. Call me tonight." She took the Heathrow Express into the city. She checked into her hotel. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed in her clothes and stared at Robert Calloway's business card, which had his name and his email address and the University of Edinburgh's crest on it. He's now retired, but still using the old cards, apparently. Then she picked up her bag and pulled out her jacket and unfolded the letter that had been living in her pocket for 4 months. I saw of her. She sat down again, and she made herself read the second half again. Carefully, word by word, the second half of Denise's letter had been written in a different tone than the first. The first half was an explanation. The second half was something closer to a confession. Denise wrote that she had looked Robert Calloway up online in 2015. She had found his faculty page at Edinburgh. She had found his books. She had seen that he was married with a daughter. She had stared at his photograph for what she described, in her careful accountant's way, as a significant amount of time, and then she had written him a letter. Not the old kind. Not the desperate searching kind of a young woman in 1989. A new letter, deliberate, adult. The letter of a woman who was 50 years old and who had been carrying something long enough to know that it was time to put it down. She mailed it in January of 2016, and then she waited. She waited for 3 months. She waited for 6, and then she stopped waiting. Because he had not written back. He had not called. He had not responded in any way. And Denise Johnson, who had already made one enormous decision, based on the belief that some distances cannot be crossed, made another one. She decided that she had been right all along, that he had moved on, that he had his life, that Maya's existence was not something he wanted to absorb into it, that she had been correct in 1989 to disappear, and she said none of this to Maya. She simply wrote it in the letter and left it in the shoebox, and died carrying the weight of having tried and been refused. Maya sat in that London hotel room and read those words, and then she sat very still for a long time, because the story had just changed. If her mother was telling the truth, and Denise Johnson was a woman who told the truth in her letters, if nowhere else, then Robert Calloway had received a letter from Denise in 2016, 8 years ago. He had received it, and he had said nothing. He had done nothing. He had continued his life in Edinburgh with his wife and his daughter. And he had simply chosen not to respond to the woman he had claimed. On a plane just hours ago, to have spent 30 years wondering about, she went through the conversation in her head again. The way he had talked about Denise, the grief in his face when he had looked at the photograph. The way he had said he had hoped to find someone else. Either he was a very good actor, or something else had happened, or both. She picked up her conference badge. She put it around her neck. She went to bed. She did not sleep. Robert Calloway flew from Heathrow to Edinburgh that same morning. He arrived home to the stone house near the university that he and Helen had lived in for 20 years. Helen was at the kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper. She looked up. She saw his face. She put the newspaper down. He sat across from her and told her what had happened on the plane. All of it. From the turbulence to the tray table to the arrivals hall. He told her Maya's name. He told her what the DNA printout had said. He told her that Denise Johnson was dead, had been dead for 5 years, and that she had apparently spent those 5 years believing he had abandoned their daughter without a word. Helen listened to all of this without moving. Her coffee went cold. When he was finished, she looked at the kitchen table for a moment. Then she looked up at him, and she said, "Robert, there is something I have to tell you." In January of 2016, a letter arrived at the Calloway house in Edinburgh. Robert was in Cape Town for a 6-month research sabbatical. Helen was managing the household alone. The mail, the bills, the maintenance requests, the small daily administration of a shared life that continues even when one half of it is on the other side of the world. The letter had a return address in Atlanta, Georgia. Helen did not recognize the name on it. She did not know Denise Johnson, had never heard the name, had no reason to connect it to anything. She opened it. She read it. And in the space of 3 minutes, Helen Calloway's understanding of her marriage, her husband's past, and what might be waiting on the other side of that letter, changed completely. The letter explained who Denise was. The letter explained what had happened in 1989, and the letter mentioned a daughter who was 25 years old and living in Atlanta, and who did not know her father was alive. Helen Calloway sat at the same kitchen table where she would later sit with Robert and hear about a plane and a DNA printout. And she made a decision. She was not a cruel woman. She was not a malicious woman. She was a woman who had been alone in a house in Edinburgh for 3 months, managing everything, and who had just opened a letter that told her that her husband had a daughter she did not about with a woman she had never heard of, from a chapter of his life that had been closed before they met. She was afraid. She was afraid in the specific, constricting way of someone who has built something carefully over and who can feel, in the pit of their stomach, the first tremor of something that might bring it down. She did not call Robert. She did not scan the letter and email it to him. She did not set it aside and wait for him to come home. She folded it. She put it in the recycling bin under the kitchen sink. And she said nothing. She had been sorry ever since. She would say this to Robert at the kitchen table 8 years later. She would not defend herself. She would not offer reasons which she knew were not the same as justifications. She would simply say, "I panicked. I was afraid of what it meant. I have been sorry every single day since." And Robert, who was a careful and precise man who chose his words deliberately, did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, he said only one thing. He said, "Denise died thinking I had refused her." He said it very quietly, and then he stopped talking. And Helen did not say anything either, because there was nothing adequate to say to that. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing either of them had heard in years. When Maya emailed Robert 2 days after landing, she kept it simple. She thanked him for the conversation on the plane. She said she had been thinking about what he had said, about the 30 years of wondering, about not being able to find Denise. She said she wanted to ask him something directly, and she hoped he would answer directly. She told him that her mother's letter mentioned a correspondence in 2016. She attached the relevant section, photographed with her phone in the hotel room. Denise's handwriting clear and unmistakable. She said, "My mother believed you received this and chose not to respond. I would like to know if that is what happened." She pressed send and then put her phone face down on the conference table and tried to listen to a presentation on pediatric trauma protocols and thought about absolutely nothing else for the next 2 hours. His response came that evening. She saw the notification while she was eating alone at a hotel restaurant. A bowl of soup she was not tasting. The message was short. It said, Ma, I need to tell you something that I have never told anyone. Please call me when you are able." She paid the bill. She went to her room. She called the number on his business card. He answered on the second ring, and his voice, when he answered, sounded like the voice of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long and has just been given permission to set it down. He told her about Helen. He told her about the letter. He told her everything, clearly, without flinching from any of it. And when he was finished, Maya sat on the edge of the hotel bed. And she held the phone, and she was quiet for long enough that he asked if she was still there. She was there. She was processing something almost too large to process, because what Robert had just told her meant that the story she had understood since reading the letter, the story of a man who had chosen silence, chosen comfort, chosen his existing life over the daughter he had never met, was not the story. The story was different. The story was a letter opened by someone it was not addressed to. The story was a decision made out of fear by a woman who loved her husband and was terrified of what the truth might cost. The story was Denise, dying believing she had been rejected, when, in fact, she had simply been intercepted, and there was nothing Maya could do with that information that would give her mother those years back. There was nothing she could do that would let Denise die knowing she had not been refused. That time was gone. That grief was sealed. And all that remained was what came next. She thought about the things that had to be true for this moment to exist. Her mother had to have died. The shoebox had to have been under the bed and not thrown away. Maya had to have finally made herself go through the apartment. She had to have found the letter. She had to have looked Robert up. She had to have not canceled the conference. Not once, not twice, not the third time she almost did it. Robert had to have decided to go back to Atlanta. He had to have come home through London on that specific airline. The airline's algorithm had to have placed them in seats 24A and 24B. The turbulence had to have hit at the right moment. She had to have reached for the armrest. All of it. Every single coincidence stacked on top of every other coincidence in exactly the right order, at exactly the right time. Remove any one of them, and neither of them is sitting in his kitchen in Edinburgh 4 months later, figuring out what to call each other. She did not say this to Robert on the phone that night. But she thought it, and she thought about her mother. Denise Johnson, who had made a decision in 1989 that she believed was protection, and who had mailed a letter in 2016 that she believed was courage, and who had died in 2019 believing that courage had been met with silence. And Maya sat with the unfairness of that for a long time. Not the unfairness of it toward herself, but the unfairness of it toward Denise. Her mother had been afraid, and then she had been brave. And then she had been wrong about what the bravery had cost her, and she had carried that wrongness to the end. And Maya, sitting in a hotel room in London, could not fix it. She could only decide what she wanted to do with what was left. What she felt, she said later, was not anger, not primarily. She understood Helen in the way that she understood her mother. As a person making a decision under pressure, from inside a fear she could not fully articulate, in a moment that did not give her the time or the grace she would have needed to make a better one. She did not forgive Helen. That was not a gift she was in a position to give. But she understood her, and understanding, she had learned from 34 years of living and 1 year of griefs, is not the same as forgiveness, but is sometimes the only door available. 4 months after Delta Flight 472, Maya Johnson flew to Edinburgh. It was October. The city was gray and cold and full of golden leaves and low light and a particular kind of beautiful that she had not expected and did not have the vocabulary for yet. She took a taxi from the airport to the address on Robert's business card, the stone house near the university, 2 stories, a dark green front door, a narrow garden that had clearly been tended by someone who cared about it. She stood outside on the pavement for 15 minutes. She had her phone in her hand. She almost called Tamara. She did not call Tamara. She put her phone in her pocket, and she rang the bell. Robert opened the door. He was wearing a gray sweater and glasses, and he looked, in the Edinburgh afternoon light, older than he had looked on the plane. Or perhaps just more real, more three-dimensional. More like a person, and less like a revelation. They stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped back, and she stepped inside. The hallway smelled of coffee and old books, and something faintly herbal. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She followed him into the kitchen, where a kettle was already on. Because he was the kind of man who puts a kettle on when he sees someone is coming, and he had known for weeks exactly when her flight was landing. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had told Helen about the plane, the same table where Helen had made her confession. And they drank tea, and they talked for 4 hours. Sarah called halfway through, and Robert put her on speaker. And Maya talked to her half-sister for the first time, which was strange and warm and slightly surreal, in the way that all of this was strange and warm and slightly surreal. Sarah said, "I have been waiting for this call my entire adult life, and I did not know it." Maya said, "That makes 2 of us." They agreed to video call the following week. There were things to work out. How much? What words to use, where the boundaries were, what was too much to ask of people who were already adults with already formed lives. None of those things resolved themselves in one afternoon in Edinburgh. But the afternoon was a beginning, the beginning of a vocabulary they were building in real time. With no template and no instructions, Robert showed her his study. It was exactly what she had imagined from his books: floor-to-ceiling shelves, a large wooden desk, a leather chair angled toward a window that looked out on the narrow garden, and, on the shelf closest to the desk, where a person would see it every time they sat down to work, was a photograph in a silver frame. She walked closer to look at it. It was a photograph of a young man at a jazz bar, his head thrown back, laughing, a drink in his hand, and his whole face lit up with something uncomplicated and alive. She recognized it immediately because she had the same photograph. The black and white version, in a shoebox in her apartment in Atlanta. She had found it among her mother's things, and here it was again, in color this time, in a frame on a shelf in Edinburgh, sitting in the exact spot where it could be seen every single day. She asked him about it. He told her that Denise had taken that photograph. It was the only photograph from that night that had survived. He had found it years later in a box of old prints, and he had kept it because it was one of the only things he still had from that time. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the shelf next to it. She noticed something that had not been there when she first looked. Or, rather, she noticed the absence of something that should have been there. Based on where the photograph was positioned, she asked him, "Was there another frame here?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." He went to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer. He took out a photograph in a plain wooden frame that had been lying face down in the drawer. He turned it over and held it out to her. It was a graduation photograph. Maya Johnson, in a cap and gown, holding a nursing degree from the Georgia State University School of Nursing. She was 24 in the photograph, smiling directly into the camera of someone with the particular smiles of someone who has worked very hard for something and is allowing themselves just for a moment to feel it. Maya stared at the photograph. Then she looked up at Robert. He said, "It arrived in the post in the autumn of 2023. There was no note, just the photograph." He said he had not known who it was. He had not recognized her. Why would he? He had never seen her face before. He had assumed it was a mistake. A wrong address. Someone else's post. He had put it in the drawer. He had almost thrown it away twice. He had not thrown it away, and now, looking at her standing in his study, he knew. Denise had sent it. In the weeks before she went into hospice, after the letter of 2016 that she believed had gone unanswered, after the years of silence that she had interpreted as refusal, Denise Johnson had found a way to leave one more thing behind. She had mailed her daughter's face to a man she believed, had chosen not to know her. Just in case. Just so that if something ever changed, if any of it ever shifted, there would be a piece of Maya already in the room. Maya stood in Robert Calloway's study in Edinburgh, and she held her own graduation photograph in her hands, and she thought about her mother, about a woman who had spent 30 years making decisions based on fear and love in roughly equal measure, who had tried once to tell the truth, and had believed that the truth had been refused, and who had, even after that, even in the last weeks of her life, been unable to completely let go, who had mailed a photograph to a man she thought had said no, as if some part of her still believed that the right piece of evidence, placed in the right hands, might eventually find its way to the right moment, as if some part of Denise Johnson had always known, even without any evidence to support it, that the story was not finished yet. Maya does not describe what she felt in that moment as closure. She says that word has never made sense to her, that grief does not close, it just changes shape, and the shape it takes is different for every person and every loss and everything that was left unsaid. What she felt was something closer to recognition, as though the pieces of a puzzle that she had not known she was holding had finally shown her what they were making. Her mother's fear, Robert's searching, Helen's panic, the returned letters, the mailed letter, the unanswered letter, the graduation photograph in a drawer, and then an airplane, and turbulence, and a hand on an armrest, and 4 words from a stranger, and 99.4%. She and Robert Calloway talk every Sunday now. He is not her father in the way that a man who raised her is a father. He is not Dad. He is not Robert, exactly. That feels too distant for what they are now. She says she is still working out the word. She says they are building the vocabulary in real time, and it is slow, and it is strange, and it is also, genuinely, something she is grateful for in a way she could not have predicted. He has read every book he wrote, all 4 of them. She told him that the one about roots and belonging made her cry, which embarrassed them both, and which was also the most honest conversation they had had so far. Sarah calls her every other Thursday. They are learning what it means to be sisters when you are already fully formed adults who have lived entirely different lives, and it turns out what it means is you show up, you answer the call, you build it slowly, carefully, in whatever time you have. The photograph that was face down in the drawer for a year is framed. Now, it sits on the shelf in Robert's study, next to the color photograph of the young man at the jazz bar. 2 photographs, 2 moments, 30 years apart. The same story told from either end. Here is what I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. What if Maya had canceled the conference? She almost did, 3 times. What if Robert had taken a different connection home? A different airline. A different day. What if the airline's algorithm had placed him in 23A and her in 25B? And there had been no shared armrest, no turbulence, no slipping hand. At what point does a chain of coincidences stop being coincidence? At what point does it become something else? Fate? Or design? Or simply the mathematics of a world in which the things we are most afraid to find have a way of finding us anyway? I do not have an answer to that. I am not sure there is one. What I know is that Denise Johnson, in 1989, tried to protect her daughter from a world she believed was not ready to hold her. And I know that in 2024, that daughter sat in a study in Edinburgh and held a photograph that her mother had mailed into the dark, not knowing if anyone would ever understand what it meant. And someone did, not in time for Denise to know it, but in time for Maya, and maybe that is the most that love can do sometimes. Send a photograph into the dark and hope. I want to hear from you. Would you have said something on that plane? Would you have kept quiet? Would you have reached out to Robert after finding the letter? Or would you have needed more time? Tell me in the comments. And also, tell me where in the world you are watching this from right now, because this community spans every continent, and I genuinely love knowing where these stories land. If this one moved you, please share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, please do. We tell stories like this one every single week. Real stories. Human stories. The kind that stay with you long after the video ends. There is another story coming next week that I have been sitting with for months, and I promise you, it is going to be worth the wait. Until then, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying.